Thank you so much for listening to Art Heals All Wounds today. Before we get to today's show, I'd like to recommend a podcast I've been enjoying. It's called Discover More, hosted by Benoit Kim. Benoit is a policymaker turned psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist who aims to highlight the magical relationship between healing and the best possible human experience. Some of his recent episodes feature topics such as why spirituality is a marketplace, the psychedelic renaissance and sexual trauma healing, and how art is the masterclass of life. Tune in to discover more on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and all your favorite listening apps. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. About a year ago, I got some feedback on my podcast. It went something like this. I don't agree with the premise of your show. Art doesn't heal you. Doctors heal you. Therapists heal you. Artists make art. I read this and I thought to myself, well, that's just sad. This person obviously doesn't know what I know. I mean, I've talked to dozens of artists. I've attended webinars. Well, I didn't know the half of it. I didn't even know the 1/100th of it. I just finished reading the new book, Your Brain on Art, How the Arts Transform Us by Susan Magsamen and Ivy Ross. What Susan and Ivy, an anthropologist, and so many people working in neuroscience have discovered about art and how it affects our brains and bodies completely shifted my perspective on everything I thought I knew about humans and art. Yes, we as humans make art. But first, art made us. Our brains wouldn't have evolved the way they did without art. So yes, art does heal us in body, mind, and spirit. But it's so much more than that. Art and creativity and aesthetic experiences make us who we are as a species. I'm so happy to have on the show Susan Magsamen, whose work, along with Ivy Ross, blew my mind wide open. I would love to hand a copy of Your Brain on Art to the person who told me the premise of my show was wrong. Not because I want to have any kind of I told you so moment, but because I want everyone to read this book. The information in this book brought me so much joy and hope. What Susan and Ivy reveal is a world of possibility. We can all, at any time, embrace the artists that we are. It's available to everyone to help us flourish, which is why Susan Magsamen is the 7th guest in the Agents of Belonging miniseries. Thank you so much for listening to Art Heals All Wounds. If you like what you're hearing, please follow us on your favorite listening app. Do you know someone who might like Art Heals All Wounds? Please share it. Susan Magsamen is the founder and executive director of the International Arts and Mind Lab, Center for Applied Neuroaesthetics from the Peterson Brain Science Institute at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She explores the intersection of brain scientists and the arts, and how our unique response to aesthetic experiences can amplify human potential. Susan's newest book from Random House is Your Brain on Art, How the Arts Transform Us. She co-wrote this book with Ivy Ross, Vice President of Design for Hardware at Google. Your Brain on Art is a journey through the science of neuroaesthetics that offers proof of how our brains and bodies are transformed when we participate in the arts and aesthetic experiences. This knowledge has the power to improve our physical and mental health, to help us learn and flourish, and to build stronger communities. Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for being on Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by introducing yourself, telling us who you are and what you do?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Susan Magsamen, and I am the founder and the director of the International Arts and Mind Lab Center for Applied Neuroaesthetics at Johns Hopkins University at the Peterson Brain Science Institute, and I'm located in the School of Medicine in the Neurology Department. And I also wear a second hat as the co-director of the NeuroArts Blueprint, which is a partnership with the Aspen Institute.
Wow. Okay. Well, that is on my list of specific questions to ask you, is this NeuroArts Blueprint. But before we get there, I would really love to know how you came to this writing the book we're going to talk about today, which is Your Brain on Art, How the Arts Transform Us. But even before that, did you come to what you're doing from an art background or from a neuroscience background or both?
So I came at this in probably the most organic way. From the time I can remember, I came from a family of makers, very curious family of 5 sisters, so big family. And when I was around 12, my twin sister had a really serious accident and she almost lost her leg. And if you know anything about twins, you know that we can read each other's minds and we can feel what the other one is feeling. I used to have a stomach ache and she'd be getting her appendix out, or my arm would twitch and she broke her arm, and vice versa. We finish each other's sentences. But when that happened, my sister really shut down, and it was because she couldn't feel what was happening to her. She really disassociated, became very withdrawn, and really was traumatized. And my mom suggested that she start to draw. And in part because she was bored, but also because my mom thought that it might be a way to share things that she couldn't just talk about. So my sister started to draw. My sister started to share these drawings. And I started to reconnect to my sister's feelings that as she would explain what she was drawing, she would have these epiphanies of what was going on with her, on her emotional life and also on her physical life. And then I was asked by her to take those messages into the world, to share notes and drawings and poetry and things that she was creating. So I think a couple things happened for me at that point. One is I realized that there are many ways to share ourselves than words, and that by creating these ways of knowing, these ways to express ourselves, we know ourselves better and the people around us know us better, and we heal. And so that really kind of set me on a course of these kinds of interconnected, deep ways of being. And then in high school, I worked at a nursing home for retired teaching nuns. And I was exposed to all of the humanities there because they were teaching nuns and they didn't stop teaching even though they were retired. And I really started to understand the power of the arts in everyday life. And so that it wasn't a nice to have, it was really a have to have. So my first undergraduate work was in creative arts therapy and what's called recreation therapy, thinking about crafts and hands-on making and things like that. And that really sort of moved me into this work. I ultimately started working at Maryland Public Television in both adult learning programs, so thinking about the role of technology and learning, and then started a company called Curiosity Kits, which are hands-on learning materials for children in arts, sciences, and world culture. So for as far back as I can remember, I was always working in this space. But I was invited by Hopkins in the early 2000s to meet with a donor who was very interested in the arts. And she believed that the arts could save us categorically. And at a medical school, you can imagine there was not a lot of expertise or even interest in that. But this donor was very compelling. She's still our donor today. And Hopkins leadership said, let's see if we can figure this out. And I was asked to come in and try to make some sense of it. And so that's how our lab started. We had in 2007 the very first event called the Science of the Arts. And it was the first attempt to bring people together who were studying the arts in some form, visual systems, auditory systems, olfactory systems, and also some people who were beginning to study sound and music, architecture, and then artists who were working using the arts either as fine artists, as professional artists, or creative arts therapists, and others who were using arts in service of health and well-being. And that's really how the lab started, very much as an aspiration to see if this was something that might be helpful, if we could translate this work into applicable interventions or practices or preventions. How might that be helpful in health, well-being, in learning, in community building, and all the things that now fast forward, 20 years, we're really starting to see so much more in the fields happening.
Wow. Well, this book that you have co-written with Ivy Ross is a profoundly perspective-shifting book for me. And I imagine that other people who read it feel the same way. And I'm wondering, when did you get the idea to write this book?
So around 2017, at the lab, we were hearing from people all over the world that they were using the arts in some way. So there had been this movement towards arts and aesthetic experiences, and it was sort of everywhere, popping up everywhere. And in some ways, it was nowhere because there had not been a coalescing of these folks that were doing work. The research might have been over here. There were silos in public health, silos in neuroscience or neurology or cognitive science. Practitioners really didn't know a lot about the research. Creative arts therapists knew about psychology and psychosocial work, but they really didn't have a sense of neurobiology. And yet there was so much energy. And one of the things that our lab had started early on was something called a luminary scholars group, where we brought together people who were doing really extraordinary work in the world. And so playwrights and architects and scientists who were already looking at the arts and using that work in their fields. And so a good example would be Benj Pasek, who wrote Dear Evan Hansen. That's an amazing play about serious mental illness. In fact, it's about someone who takes their life and how the community comes around and how we cope and how we try to fit in and how we survive and how we thrive. And it's about family and friends. And so I had reached out to Ivy Ross on LinkedIn. I didn't know her, but I knew her work from being the head of Mattel's. She was the VP of the girls division at Mattel. And at that, Mattel owns Barbie. And I was really intrigued with the way she ran her team, her design team. So they weren't just trying to think about what they thought girls liked. They were working with young girls, and they were really trying to understand their motivations, their challenges, their disconnects. And I remember at the time, one of the things she was working on was getting Barbie in tennis shoes, which I thought was so smart, because Barbie wasn't just about high heels and bathing suits and pool. She had other interests. And, it was this idea of how do you really create a whole person. And a girl that came out of a family of girls, we were all of those things. We did everything in our house. So I really related to this idea of Barbie not just being about sort of a glitter girl, but a real girl and a real woman. And how would you build a role model around that? So I reached out to Ivy and said, we'd love to introduce you to this work. And we got on a phone call, and we thought it would be a half an hour call. And every 30 minutes, she would say to me, can you cancel your next appointment? And I'd say yes. And then I'd say, can you cancel your next appointment? And she'd say yes. And 3 hours later, we were like so in sync. And, she had known that the arts changed us because she's an intuit, she's an artist. But what she found fascinating was that there was proof to showing how that was possible. And she was also so curious and so interested in learning more. So she invited my husband and I out to have dinner with her and her husband to just kind of get to know each other a little bit more, to think about would this be the right fit. And coming out of that, we decided to have a salon at her house where we invited, she calls it the Noah's Ark meeting, 2 dancers, 2 visual artists, 2 psychiatrists, 2 neuroscientists, 2 philanthropists. And we pulled these folks together because it was about the same time where the NeuroArts Blueprint was coming together. And I wanted to see if, in fact, I could break down those silos and bring people together. And we hadn't done that before. So I thought, in someone's home, in a really kind of curated group, could we really get at how we might build this field together? And this was so early days. What did that really look like? So we decided that we would start with kind of an icebreaker, which was, have the arts in any way ever influenced your life or affected your life? And I told the story that I just told you about my sister, and we went around the room and people were crying, they were commiserating, they were compassionate, but every single person had an amazing story, whether it was about being dyslexic and learning about film, and ultimately this person became a pretty famous film producer, or someone else who believed that architecture, space, kind of was the core of your life, really interested in how space continues to work today, and there's lots of great stories around that. People who were exposed to photography to tell their story when they were in really difficult situations, theater, dance. And at the end of the event, we were cleaning up, and I said to Ivy, I've always wanted to write a book for the general public, because while policy is essential and sustainability is really critical, more research is really important, I think there's so much that we know right now that could help us today. And if we could write a book for the general public, sort of just bringing this work together and explaining that we are wired for the arts, we could really begin to make a groundswell. So I said, would you be interested in writing this with me? And she said, this is the book I've been waiting for. And, she's been asked to write lots of books as a creative and as someone who's worked in businesses. But she sort of felt like she'd done that. But this, for her, was something that she thought really would be meaningful. So that was 5 years ago. And we really went to work. And it's truly been a labor of love. We've interviewed over 125 people. And at one point, our publisher said, you have to stop. You have to stop. We were going to write 70,000 words, and it's 82,000 words. And really, there could be volume 2, volume 3, volume 4, volume 5, because there's so many extraordinary pieces of research and so many great ways that the arts influence and change and impact our lives.
Right, right. And the book that you did, it is something both to be savored and then to read a few times and to go back to different sections, because each section sort of brought up a new amazing idea that is not necessarily our common sense view of ourselves and the arts. I do want to go through and ask you about some specific terms that are important and pop up over and again. So neuroplasticity, what is it and why is it such a important term in talking about the arts for us?
Sure. So, it's only been in the last 20 years that advances in technology have enabled us to get inside our heads to study the extraordinary ways the arts work. And it turns out that arts and aesthetic experiences actually work at a molecular level. And so when you use this term neuroplasticity, I think the best way to describe it is that you're born with 100 billion neurons. So you're born with these neurons that are almost infinite. And you also are born with what we know of now as 5 sensory systems. And there's probably many more that we're discovering now that are the ways that we bring the world into our bodies and brains. So, our senses are these mechanisms, and they're extraordinary, that allow us to bring all of these stimuli in. And it's when we bring in those stimuli, you're actually creating synaptic connections. And those synaptic connections, those are the connections that connect those 100 billion neurons. And through that, you're creating endless circuits and neural pathways. And those neural pathways go all through your brain, and they actually underlie your emotions, memory, physical movements. Basically, everything that you do is because of these neural pathways that have been connected through your sensorial experiences. And so they change as you have different sensorial experiences. Some synapses and neural pathways get stronger because you're using them, and the information that's encoding them is highly salient. And I'll explain what that means in a second, because I think salient experiences are really important. But then other synaptic connections get weaker and sometimes, really just sort of fade away as these other neural pathways get stronger. And that's called neuroplasticity.
Okay. Well, let's follow up with you explaining what you mean by these salient experiences. And then I have more questions, of course, but what were you going to add to that would help us understand this?
So I think, we are exposed to infinite number of sensorial experiences and sensory inputs throughout just a day. There's so much that we're exposed to, and that can take all shapes and sizes, all, positive and negative, very wide range of experiences. And that could be around light or smell or touch, taste. But salient experiences are those experiences or moments that resonate with us on a neurobiological level. You could never pay attention to all the sensory stimuli that's coming into your body at a given moment, and you could never process all the emotions that would emerge from that. So your brain is sort of an expert at filtering out the many inputs that are seemed irrelevant, that aren't important, so that you can focus its attention on what is pertinent. So something that's salient to you is something that's either important practically or emotionally. And researchers are discovering that these highly salient experiences, like the arts and aesthetics, are actually creating really significant new synapses in the brain. And they're helping to create a repository of stored knowledge and responses that for each of us are as unique as our fingertips. So what I'm trying to say is that because my life experiences, my genetics, the way that I process information, the way my sensory systems process, no one has the same exact brain as anyone else. So, and as a result, you are what you experience.
Wow. That's really amazing. There are another couple of terms that come up quite a bit, and I want to ask them about them also to get a clearer idea of what you mean, but also because you are writing such a comprehensive idea of what it means to be a human being and how we are affected by our environment, our activities. So there is a term that comes up quite a bit, neuroaesthetics, which initially that surprised me. Instead of just saying arts, you were using this term neuroaesthetics. And if it's helpful to compare it to something like NeuroArts, or if you just want to explain it on your own, either way works.
So the term neuroaesthetics is a term that was coined around the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it was around the time when this neurotechnology was really allowing us, and biomarkers were really allowing us to get inside of our heads in a non-invasive way. And you could go back for centuries to talk about Plato and Aristotle. They were doing neuroaesthetics then too, right? They were really thinking about this connection between the subconscious and the conscious mind, between the mind and the body. So the concepts are not new, but the term neuroaesthetics was coined around that time. And basically, it's the study of how arts and aesthetic experiences measurably change the brain, body, and behavior. And then the second part is really important: how this knowledge can be translated into specific practices that advance health and well-being. So the science is called neuroaesthetics. Sometimes it's applied neuroaesthetics. the field, so building a field like bioethics or neuroscience or building the field of women's health, the field is called NeuroArts. So it's really sort of the shorthand for neuroaesthetics, and it's highly interdisciplinary. So, it includes all of the basic sciences, but also sometimes philosophy, sometimes sociology, public health, education. By nature, we're so complex, and the field needs to be transdisciplinary in order to really manifest a generative response to these physiological, psychological, sociological kinds of impacts that the arts and aesthetic experiences really create for us.
Right. And that's one thing I really appreciated about this book is that you didn't silo off art, like what would be a conventionally defined area of practice. You opened it up to other things like gardening, like being in nature, like how you arrange the space around you, which most people would not think of as anything having to do with art. But you do talk about how this is affecting you in very profound ways. And I do want to now go back to asking you, what is the NeuroArts Blueprint that you've created?
So the NeuroArts Blueprint is a co-collaboration with the Aspen Institute, and it came out of what I was sharing earlier, where we were hearing all over the world that the arts were being used in so many extraordinary ways, and yet folks didn't know each other. And we started to really think about, well, what if they did? And sort of the rub on all of this is that there's not that much funding, public funding, that goes into researching the arts or paying for arts practitioners, whether they are creative arts therapists that sometimes have licensure in different states, or even somebody like a community artist who's doing murals in a community, or a public health person, or a psychologist that might be using the arts, or a social worker. While there are so many people using the arts for different purposes, like other kinds of interventions, there's just not the dissemination or scaling that's really available. And so working with the Aspen Institute, my colleague there is Dr. Ruth Katz. She runs the Health, Medicine, and Society program. We spent 2 years really with our ear to the ground, talking to artists, arts practitioners, researchers, policymakers, funders all over the world. And coming out of that, we created a 5-year global initiative to build the field of neuroarts, which with the main goal to ensure that the arts and the uses of the arts in all of its forms becomes part of mainstream medicine and public health. And to achieve that, there's 5 core recommendations that we can talk about. But the bottom line is that we've now taken those recommendations and turned them into an implementation plan. So we're building now what I call a virtual watering hole, where anyone in the world, regardless of what their perch is, can come to that watering hole to meet someone, to get more information, to sign up for a workshop, to join an organization, to listen to someone else's spotlight on a program, to find each other, and then to take that knowledge back to their community wherever they are. And also building something called the Community NeuroArts Coalitions, which are hyper-local networks all over the world of researchers, practitioners, cultural arts organizations, community arts organizations, and others in a community that really want to use the arts and aesthetic experiences in service in their community to help address some really intractable issues like substance abuse or domestic violence and trafficking or trauma, PTSD, or just looking really deeply at quality of life and the ways that a community can come together as they are using these experiences that are ancient, that we're born into, to be able to really create and flourish in the very complex world that we're living in today.
Yeah, and you have some beautiful examples of that in the book. But since we are talking about ancient things, you talk about awe and wonder. I have a lot of places in the book where I experience that. But one of my favorites is in the section on community that talks about how all of this got started, which is interestingly with fire, with early humans starting to bring fire that was naturally occurring from lightning back to where they were living. And it is such a beautiful idea, but also full of some surprising things. I'm wondering if you could read from that section. I think it's on page 203.
It would be my pleasure. I had the real privilege of meeting with E.O. Wilson before he passed. Ivy and I were able to spend some time with him. If for those of you who may not know, E.O. Wilson was evolutionary biologist who really spent a lot of time thinking about ultimately the origins of humanity and the origins of creativity. And he shared this perspective with us that we ultimately put into the book. So let me just read a little bit from that chapter. During the day, language developed to address the basic daily needs of the group, from the logistics of tracking animals to caring for children and preparing food. At night, though, something remarkable happened. Fires were built, wood crackled into flame, and wood smoke, heady and fragrant, filled the air. A honeydew glow warmed faces and illuminated the dark for the first time, offering warmth and protection from predators. So began the lasting human desire to make a circle, stare into the flickering fire, and commune. The pragmatism of the day made way for the mystery and evocative nature of night, as fire fostered new forms of coming together. We created stories, we sang, we danced, we developed myths and metaphors that passed on the moral and ethical values of the group. We celebrated and we mourned. We began to sing and move together, and these movements of shared emotion and sound formed bonds, collective transcendence, and communal joy. Here, around the fire, creative human expressions developed as an important layer of meaning-making and belonging. It is in this very place that the activities that we now call the arts began to take shape as an evolutionary priority to keep us alive. Art making laid the basic foundation for culture and community among our earliest ancestors. By stimulating the neurobiological reward system, these early gatherings helped to seed the social value of community. Researchers now know that participating in and fostering social connections in this way is akin to exercise for the brain. It improves cognitive function, lowers stress, and diminishes depression. And through mirror neurons, it allows our species to build empathy and understanding with others. Witnessing and beholding art taught us about ourselves and the world.
That is such an amazing passage and an amazing idea, which I will admit that it actually, in my mind, I think I've always thought of it backwards. Well, because the concept that you say more explicitly is that art creates culture, culture creates communities, and communities create humanity. And I think in my mind, I've had it backwards. There are humans, we create a community, and then that community creates culture, and somewhere there are people who are elevated enough to be called artists. But it's actually, in fact, the opposite. And you talk about the tremendous growth of the brain from this point forward, which is also incredible. It really illustrates how we evolved through art.
And nothing else. And that without that ability, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be a species. And I think, because we've elevated art to a rarefied, often commercialized, quantifiable entity that's a nice to have, a luxury, something that's sort of you set aside and if you have time for, I would argue that we have left on the table so much of our humanity and the skills and the capacities that we need to really be in the world, but also to solve the problems of the world. And so coming back to that birthright, that the fact that we are literally wired that way and that we forgot it. We set it aside, I think, with the best intentions, but it's been the wrong decision.
Yeah. you do talk about ways in which turning back to both arts and this whole idea of, neuroarts and neuroaesthetics can have a profound effect on helping various communities and addressing certain social issues. So I am really curious to know, what about all of this gives you hope?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think it's so joyful. One of the things about arts and aesthetic experiences is, you can't dance without laughing. You can't dance without feeling just a little bit lighter. You can't sing without activating your parasympathetic nervous system and your vagus nerve. You feel better. Your mood shifts. And I think we can't solve problems out of despair. We have to shift our emotions. You can't sing in a chorus without feeling connected. You can't synchronize with others. That happens automatically when you are dancing and moving together. So I think there are so many rich answers in all of this that comes forward in a joyful, effortless way. And we just feel better. I mean, we feel better emotionally, we feel better physically. It's instantaneous, it's accessible, and I think it's so achievable without expense. And that I think makes me very, very hopeful at an individual level, at a community level, and at a societal level.
Yeah.
And maybe I would just add that, we have a really beautiful section in the book about somatic experiences for healing racial trauma. And in the book, we talked with Resma Manikims, who is a somatic therapist. And what he talks a lot about is that Black and Indigenous people don't have the experience of post-traumatic stress because they're living with persistent and pervasive traumatic stress all the time. And so moving and humming and sharing stories throughout traumatic experiences that continue to happen were part of what has kept the Black community strong and being able to transcend and sometimes just cope through such oppression. And I think we all have micro traumas and macro traumas in our lives. And so I found it really inspiring to talk with someone who really has experienced trauma and stress, but by humming and rocking and shaking and swaying and dancing and making art to really redirect the way the body is using the stored energy of trauma also is incredibly hopeful to me.
And because you said that, I will just name one of my oh my gosh, this is incredible moments reading this, is a section on healing the body. In case anyone imagines that arts just gives you a temporarily feel better moment, the section on healing the body is really amazing. And again, it just upends every idea I have about how we function as humans and how participating in the arts really, really affect us, as you said earlier, on a cellular level. So that was really beautiful too.
One of the things in that chapter, in the Healing the Body chapter, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to organize that. And we decided to talk about chronic illness, like the things that happen to us, aches and pains every day, like headaches, or, thinking about where you might be having something that you can move through, but it's really, really difficult, even into things like palliative care and end of life care. Or, there are times in our lives where something has happened physically where we're not going to go back to the person that we were, but we're cracked open into a new person. And that can be something like Parkinson's. And have Parkinson's disease, where you are lost the ability to create dopamine. And so your gait deteriorates, cognition often can be influenced, you can't sleep, mood changes. And something as simple as dance can help you regain some of those attributes. And sometimes just for a short time, but now we're learning with more and more research that dance can really be like a medication with dose and dosage. So the more you do it, the better it is, the longer it lasts. And so we're learning a lot about the neurobiology of these different art forms that can really affect the progression of diseases and disorders.
Yeah, that whole chapter was incredibly done, and the examples that you gave are amazing. And I think really this idea about working with chronic disease and chronic pain were profound, and just profound revelations to me. I loved all the sections, but I think that one and the community section were the ones that had the biggest impact as I was reading them. So it's a wonderful book, and I'm so glad that you and Ivy wrote it. I'm wondering if you can tell us where people can find out more about the work you're doing. Of course, obviously, where they can find the book, but also if they want to follow along about what's happening with this NeuroArts Blueprint or things like that. How do they do that?
Sure. So the NeuroArts Blueprint has a website, and it's called neuroartsblueprint.org. And there are several initial reports and studies that are there, and they're highly readable. And we're always posting webinars. I think we do 4 a year now. And it's really a community that's vibrant and everyone's welcome. And as I mentioned, the NeuroArts Resource Center will be up by the end of this calendar year. And that's really a place to come and hang out. And we'll be bringing people together physically as well. So definitely go there. You can also go to the International Arts and Mind Lab website. That's my website at Hopkins. And that's just Arts and Mind Lab at jhu.edu. And there's lots of stuff there about ways to study the arts. We have a generative model called the Impact Thinking Model, and we have a COVID-19 field guide, which still is very relevant today. There's lots of interesting materials there. And then yourbrainonart.com, you can go, and we post regularly. There's a great article section of kind of just sharing more stories. That was something that with the book we just couldn't include all of the amazing things that are happening in the world. So we have a section called articles, which are just stories of things that are happening, and it's very current. And so that's a really fun place too.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. This is a conversation I have looked forward to, and it's definitely a book that I needed to read, even if I thought I knew something about arts and healing. So thank you so much.
It's really a pleasure. Thank you so much for just your thoughtfulness in going through it. And you're reminding me of some of the pieces of the book that I really loved that I haven't come back to, and it's interesting. Everyone that reads the book reads it a different way. And there's something in it for everyone. And that was my hope, is that we organized it in a way where, like right now, those are your 2 favorite chapters. And in a year, you may come back and say, the learning chapter is really speaking to me, because I think all of the twists and turns in our lives and the sorrows and joys, we need different things at different times. And what's so extraordinary is that regardless of what that moment is for you right now, there's something from the arts and aesthetic experiences that you can bring into your life right now. So I love what you found, because it helps me remember something that I hadn't honed in on in a while.
It's definitely a book to be read more than once. And I'm so glad you're ending on this idea that the arts and aesthetics are for everyone, and not just as a little creative treat, but we need them. That is what makes us human and keeps us human. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Susan Magsamen for being on the show to talk about her book, Your Brain on Art, How the Arts Transform Us. I'm so inspired by the work that Susan does, and I'm grateful that she and Ivy Ross teamed up to share their lifetime of discovery and research on the intersection between the arts and neuroscience. I'll put links in the show notes to Susan's info, where you'll find information on the book and her other work. This book was such an interesting read, with passages that actually gave me chills. It's no wonder it's become a bestseller, and I hope that even more people read it. I'd love to hear from anyone listening who's read your brain on art and what you took away from it, and what surprised you. You can always reach me through my website, arthealsallwoundspodcast.com. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. As always, this show was recorded using Squadcast FM. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.